Matese, February 4th, 1938. According to my parents, it was a very cold, snowy day in the mountains of Gale Matese that I was born in 1938. Although I was awaited with great joy, February was not the best time to be born in a town without central heating, um, as was usual in all the houses at that time in our town. The midwife was called, the fire roared in the kitchen fireplace. My grandmother encouraged my mother. Finally, I was born, washed and swaddled, as were all children in Galo at that time. The bed warmer was used to warm the bed, and I slept between my parents for the first night. Supposedly, our family was better off than most families in town. My grandfather owned a store. He sold wines, liquors, pasta, and a few other items. His parents had come from Fara San Martino in Abruzzo. Why they came to Gallo, I have no idea. But noticing that there were no stores there, and they had 3 sons, each of the sons opened a different type of store. My grandfather Nicola made and sold wines. Zio Luigino sold tobacco and also occasionally killed and sold meats. The other son sold dry goods. The 3 brothers went on to have large families who eventually went into other businesses. My mother, on the other hand, came from a very old family that had lived in Gallo far back as one could remember. According to my mother, Angela di Pietrantonio, her great-grandfather kept all the records of who owned which land in Gallo. Her family owned land, sheep, and supposedly were also somewhat well off, according to the standing of a small town. I was baptized a few days after my birth. It was customary not to wait long for baptisms due to the fact that babies did not always survive. My name is Carmela for my grandmother, Lucia for a sister of my father who had died, Giuseppina for another dead sister, and Anna. Anna was my cousin and very much alive, but had left a few years ago for America, and my grandparents felt they would never see her again, which was true, they never did. Okay, why does this child keep crying? Should I keep reading? Everything went well for the first few months of my life. Suddenly, I would not stop crying day or night, and even when I had just been nursed. Dottore Pilla was called and announced that I was starving. On examining my mother, he found that she was pregnant again, and her milk did not have any food value for me. It was imperative that I be given baby formula, but none was available in our town. My grandfather went to a larger town, probably Isernia or Venafro, and bought all the formula he could find. This was not very much due to shortages because of the unsettled conditions in Europe. Nevertheless, this helped me temporarily. In a small village, nothing was a secret. A mother whose child was dying because of the same problem begged my mother for help. I have heard you have something that is helping your baby. Please share some with me. What good will that do you? I cannot give you enough to make a real difference, and when I run out, who knows where I will get more. For the love of God, just give me a little bit so he will stop crying for a while. My mother relented and gave her a little of the formula, not knowing what would happen after her own formula had run out. Fortunately for me, a lady who was nursing her own child had lots of milk and agreed to feed me with her son. Years later, she would come to visit me and relate this story. My mother, the last time she told me this story, added, "You know, the little boy who got some of the formula survived also." Trying to leave the war behind. The American consulate kept sending letters to my mother, who was an American citizen, that she must not delay in being repatriated as soon as possible.
So why was she an American citizen? How did she have citizenship?
Because her father and mother were American citizens. Her father came to the America early on. He went to work in the coal mines in Pennsylvania. But every couple of years he would go home and there would be another child born. But he was an American citizen. His wife somehow was an American citizen, and therefore my mother and everybody else was an American citizen. And she had American papers, but she didn't come because she married my father. She didn't come to the United States with her whole family when they came back to the United States. So she stayed in Gallo. But they kept writing. She had American citizenship papers, and they kept writing to her. So they kept, that must not delay being repatriated as soon as possible, as conditions for American citizens in Europe were becoming worse and worse. Her mother, father, sister, and 2 brothers had already left and were living in New York. My mother had remained to marry my father. Now, with an Italian husband and a baby, things were very complicated. My father also had other concerns. At 24, he had completed his military duty, but Mussolini, eager for power, was recalling many of the young men back into the army. This was not something my father was willing to do. My parents hurried to get their papers in order. My father was able to get a passport and visa to the U.S. because he was the husband of an American citizen. My mother placed me on her passport because she thought I was an American citizen. This was a grave mistake. We left for Naples, arrived. My father's cousins, Michele, he had a business where he drove people to the consulate and all that stuff. And he helped people with the consulate from Gallo maneuver through the bureaucracy of securing passports and visas in Naples to exit Italy. I was 8 months old. Everything appeared ready. However, the last minute, my parents were told that I could not board the ship, or as my passport was not valid. I should not have been placed on my mother's passport, and I was not an American citizen. They could leave if they wanted, but I could not go. How could they leave an 8-month-old child behind? My parents decided that it was imperative that my father leave Italy due to the war situation. My mother felt that everything could be arranged in a few months, and we could join my father and her family in New York. Little did they know that it would be 8 years before they would see each other again. Okay.
Well, my grandfather ended up coming over, but my grandmother ended up staying.
Yeah, this is the passport picture that is on. Let's see. It's in here somewhere. It's the passport picture. Oh, here it is. This is the passport picture. This is the passport picture of my mother and me. Yeah. And so this is, and Naples, The fall of 1938.
Hang on just a second. I got a little technical.
You do this.
Okay. Okay.
Naples, the fall of 1938. Naples was throbbing with desperate people, converging in Naples from many European countries, trying to escape the Nazi persecution. Mrs. Flack's parents sailed from Naples. For many, it was a matter of life or death. For my father's cousin Michele Santoro, who worked as a liaison between the people of Gallo and the Italian American and Canadian consulates in Naples and South America consulate, had many contacts and tried to help my father book passage to the U.S. My mother said that Michele came to tell my father that he thought he had been able to book him a passage and that they must leave immediately. That meant my father and Michele. My mother, as she told the story, said that she was so sure that my father would not be able to board the ship that she did not even cry when he left. According to my father, this ship was leaving under the guise of visiting different places around the Mediterranean. On board were many people of different nationalities, all speaking different languages. Fortunately, many could speak French, so they were able to communicate. For a 25-year-old, this was an exciting adventure. Evidently, to disguise the real purpose of helping people escape Europe, the ship made several stops around the Mediterranean. Most of these young people aboard found it a welcome respite from the war. My father used some of his time to begin to learn English from a book he was able to obtain on board. As he had never heard the words pronounced by an English speaker, he used phonics that were printed beside the words. My father never lost a strange pronunciation he learned from some of the English word. At this time, although he became quite literate in English, my brother and I always cringed when we heard my father pronounce "ashtrays" for ashtray. Pregnant used the Italian pronunciation as pregnant. The trip proceeded smoothly until he was ready to disembark in New York. The customs officials were going over his papers when they noticed that he was entering the U.S. because he was the husband of an American citizen. Where is this American citizen they asked him. At this point, my father spotted my mother's sister, Antoinetta, with my grandfather. According to my father, he pointed to my aunt and said, "There she is." He proceeded to walk over to my aunt and give her a great big hug and kiss. If she was startled, we don't know. At this point, my grandfather also had to sign papers that he was willing to support my father so that my father would not become a charge on the U.S. Fortunately for all concerned, my father, a cabinet maker, was able to quickly find work. Let's see, if you want to look at the picture of my aunt, there's somewhere. Oh, this is my grandfather and this is my mother's father and mother.
Show us that.
And
That's your grandmother and your grandfather.
That's right.
On your mom's side.
On my mom's side, and this is a picture was taken in the park in New York. I'm trying to find. where the picture is. I don't know where that is, but there is a picture of my aunt here. Oh, here they are. This was the aunt. This was the aunt that. This was the aunt that. And
That
but
he
he.
saw,
Yeah, that he's. Yeah.
did he know they were traveling together? Or did
They
he
weren't
just-
traveling
he just
together.
happened to see them in immigration in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
US?
yeah. And when he was getting off the boat, he says, "Where's your wife?" And he said, "There she is." And of course, but they all knew each other from Italy. But she was she was Antoinette. She was younger than my mother. But yeah. So anyway, so that's okay. Back home to Gallo. Do you want me to go on? My mother and I returned to Gallo to live with my paternal grandparents. That's,
Your dad, your
yeah.
father's grandparents.
Yeah,
Your grandparents on your dad's side.
Dad.
So you were in Gala with them.
yeah, with Aunt Adele
And your mom.
and my mom, yeah,
Yeah.
because my Aunt Adele, who was about 15, she was the one that's still living. My Uncle Vincent, who was about 17, and already interested in studying for the priesthood. And my father's twin sister, Marianina, was married and living nearby, and many other relatives.
But that's not the one that moved to Weirton.
No, she was already in Weirton. She had already come to the United States. She'd married. She was the oldest sister.
But not the one that lived down the street from Grandpa.
That's right. That was the oldest sister. My grandpa's old.
So that's not who you're talking about.
No, I'm talking to his twin sister.
Okay.
I was wait a minute, and many other. I had lots of love and attention for my mother. However, pregnant and separated from her parents, her husband and brothers and sister, it was a difficult time. The new passports for us to leave for America were not forthcoming, and the due date for my brother's birth was fast approaching. We were 13 months. My brother Tony was born on March 2nd, 1939. I was 13 months old. My brother was given the name Antonio because evidently I had been going around the house saying Tonino, Tonino, and this was taken as a sign that he should be named. It should be named to commemorate St. Anthony, the patron saint of Gallo. Of course, there were many Toninos in Gallo, so I am sure that I had heard the name often. One of the stories passed on to me was about my brother's baptism. At the dinner after the baptism, I was sitting next to my grandfather. My grandfather handed me a glass of water with only 1 or 2 drops of wine. According to my grandfather, he told me to say alla salute. Before drinking, I looked at him and said, "Elevaci l'acqua," meaning take out the water. Then, take out the water. Supposedly, one of the men at the table burst out laughing and said, "Who said that?" Amazed that I could talk. Years later, whenever I met this man, he would laugh and retell the story. Okay, September 1943. Now, this is when things get really. My first clear memory is of the Italian armistice in September 1943. I wake up to what seemed to me the middle of the night. All the lights in the house were on. Outside, the church bells were ringing, and there was a great deal of noise, shouting, crying. My brother Tony was sleeping in a large cradle by the bed I shared with my mother. He was also awake and standing in his cradle. No one else was around. I thought to myself that the English must be arriving. For some unknown reason, I was very afraid of them. Sitting by the fire each evening, I must have listened to the adults discussing the war. Somehow I had learned the names of the leaders: Churchill, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Roosevelt. some whose pictures I may have seen. I imagine them like themselves, but Churchill in my mind wore large gold earrings and looked like a pirate. If the English were coming, I did not want to be captured. So the only thing to do was to jump out of the balcony into the cobbles road under the balcony. Fortunately, as I was dragging the chair to the balcony so that I could climb out and jump out of the window, my aunt Adelina came into the room. She must have dressed us and taken us to the church where everyone was gathering. The church looked strange. The lights in the back of the church were not lit, but candles and lights were lit on the altar. What a hubbub! People praying out loud, crying, and some giving prayers of thanksgiving. Some parents were crying. Why had their sons been killed so close to the end of the war? Others understood when could they expect their sons home. The priest, Don Michele, came out and tried to quiet everyone down. He was not happy and tried to explain, the war is not over. It is only beginning for us. The armistice had been signed with the Allies, American English, but the Italian government had fled Italy, and Italy was totally occupied by Germans.
What year was this?
1943, September 1943.
So you would have been 6.
I would have been five.
Five.
I was, yeah. The people did not want to believe him. Besides, what could the Germans want with us? Gallo was a small village, about 3,000 people, high in the Apennine Mountains. There were no main highways. Reaching it, why come here? Nevertheless, we were close to Monte Cassino and would become a throughway for every Allied army, Americans, English, French, Moroccans. It did not take long for things to change for us. A few days after the signing of the armistice, Germans began to make forays to Gallo, taking food and other materials. One day, as I was playing with a friend, someone came by to tell me to go home. The Germans were at our house searching for gold. They had my grandfather and were forcing him to show them all through the house. As they found no gold, they left. These were not the SS. These were the regular German army. Our house and the house of our relatives became a hive of activity. Since we had some of the larger houses, they would be the first to be searched. My mother had to make sure that none of her documents or letters showing that she was an American citizen would be found. My mother's family had a good deal of land scattered in various places outside of the town. With the help of some family members, they went out to dig holes and hide what they could: passports, liquors from my grandfather's store, and whatever valuable they wanted to protect from the Germans. I remember watching as one of my uncles, actually my father's first cousin, was building a closet that would be filled with items and covered by a brick wall. One had to be careful that the closet did not sound hollow when the Germans knocked on the wall. All the radios had already been confiscated. The newspapers were mailed to us from Naples, but the mail was no longer reliable. It seems that Don Michele, the priest had a hidden radio. My mother, with a few others, would go to his house in the evening to see if there would be a broadcast. Sometimes there would be no broadcast. Oftentimes there would be strange messages. So and so sends best wishes to Mario. Mario has lost a sheep. Some of these messages probably were coded for the partisans or other people. Occasionally there would actually be news of what was the situation. I would lie in bed waiting for my mother to come home. Her shoe made a special sound on the cobblestones outside her balcony. I could tell when she was on the way home. Now I could fully relax and fall asleep. Although it was difficult for the Gallese to believe that soldiers would come to our remote area, the Allies commanders decided to come inland through the mountains to go to Rome. Rather, did they realize what the terrain was like to cross? Ernie Pyle, in Ernie's War, described what this area was like. The country is shockingly beautiful and just as shockingly hard to capture from the enemy. The hills rise to the high ridges, almost solid rock. You can't go around them through the flat, peaceful valleys because the Germans look down upon you and would let you have it. Some of the young men from our area volunteered to show the Americans a different route, but for whatever reason, their help was not accepted. As a result, there were more American casualties than necessary. The Germans had a clear view of the Americans marching in the valley. The country was so difficult that a cavalry division with hundreds of horses and mules had to be used to reach areas where vehicles could go no further. Soldiers used to mountains had to be brought in from different areas. There was only one road reaching Gallo, which motorized vehicles could be used. After they reached us, where could they go? Despite all logic, they came. We found ourselves in the front line. At first, things were not so bad for our family. We had food. The roads were teeming with different people. Disbanded Italian soldiers trying to reach home. Women and children, old people, old refugees fleeing the Germans. Where were they going? They may not have known themselves. My grandmother would try to feed some of the starving young men, and we often had refugees that we knew from other towns staying with us. I remember the man who had been my father's teacher, Il Maestro, when my father had been apprenticed as a cabinet maker, and his family stayed with us. What will we do when we're not run out of food? This was a real concern at this point. And in our area, there were no rations. It was completely up to the people to take care of themselves. My brother and I seemed to know that we did not ask for seconds, nor did we ask to eat when it was not time. It was a different time, especially for mothers of young children. However, we always felt safe and happy as long as we were with our families. It is difficult for me to imagine what it must have been like for children who were evacuated from their families. Should I go on?
Yeah.
A picnic in the country. One day we left town early. My mother, my grandmother, my Aunt Adele, my brother, and various uncles, aunts, and cousins carrying some food and drinks and headed for some caves in the mountains. My cousin Rosalinda, who was about 5 years old, had to be carried because she was recuperating from an operation on her hip and had to wear a cast. It appears that we were expecting to be bombed, but we children knew only that we were going to the mountains. It was a lovely day. We arrived at the mouth of a cave and settled down to wait. There were fresh water from a spring. Every now and then we heard and saw a few planes. When we saw the planes, we went inside the cave, but we were not to go too far. The cave had not been explored. For the adults, it must have been a nerve-wracking day, but we children enjoyed playing outside with occasional period of quiet in the cave. I don't remember if we saw bombs being dropped on this occasion, but we definitely heard mortars and bombs on other occasions. By late afternoon, the adults decided that we had to go home. Had they received word that it was clear? I don't know. Nevertheless, the children had had a great day. Things were soon to take a more serious turn. The bombing of Izernia. Okay, this we could watch this. My grandfather always got up very early, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. He enjoyed going to trips of discovery. Supposedly these trips were to discover new items to sell at our store or to replenish items that were running low. As usual, he left very early one morning to attend the market in Izernia. Around noon, we began hearing the sounds of planes. My mother and Aunt Adele and grandmother, my brother-in-law, all ran to the piazza. It was quite a show. We had never seen so many planes. The planes were in formation of about 40 at a time. We tried to count them as they passed over our heads. The planes passed, slowed down, and began to drop bombs. We could see the bombs, but we could not see them hit. After dropping the bombs, the planes turned around and again passed over our heads. We children were mesmerized as we watched what was going on. These were American planes. They were not German planes. The adults, particularly my grandmother, was becoming very concerned. The planes had demolished the market in Izernia. Although we were too far away to see the damage, we knew my grandfather was there and could assume the number of planes and bombs that the damage was considerably. Fortunately, my grandfather had left before the bombing began. The destruction was terrible. There were no soldiers in Izernia, but a great number of civilians were killed. My Uncle Vincent, the seminarian, told us years later that a pharmacist that he knew was buried in the basement of his pharmacy for about a week. This man survived on materials that were in the pharmacy. He was found after about a week. Some other people were not so lucky, particularly some children who hid in a well. There is now a museum in Izernia which shows many of these scenes. Izernia was bombed September 16, 1943, and this was only 13 days after the armistice.
Hang on one second. Let's get this. Let's see if we can set it up for you on hold.
Yay.
Now,
Okay.
this was my grandfather. Now he wore,
Okay, show it.
you know why he wore a hat? Because he was bald. He always wore a hat.
So that was the grandfather that you stayed with.
Yeah, that was the grandfather we stayed with, yeah. my grandmother. My grandmother's here too somewhere. I think. Gary put. She's in here somewhere. He was quite. This grandfather was quite a character. I'll tell you that. But supposedly he could walk through a vineyard and he could and make an offer to see how much wine he could make. He was unbelievable about making wine. This was my grandmother.